Please subscribe, like, and share. It really helps us out. And of course, if you have any questions, comment below and we will answer you as soon as we can. Welcome to another video in our series on IGCSE History. In today's lesson, we will be looking at the Vietnam War between 1954 and 1975. If you haven't seen our previous videos, click on the card above.
Today we will be looking at the Vietnam War from 1954 to 1975. In 1965, the US launched Operation Rolling Thunder, the bombing of military targets in North Vietnam. Vietnam is a long way from America, so why did the US get involved in this conflict? Firstly, we should look at some of the background to the Vietnam conflict. Vietnam had been a French colony before it was occupied by the Japanese during World War II. After World War II, it was returned to French control, but many Vietnamese people wanted independence. As a result, in the 1950s, the French found themselves fighting a war against the Viet Minh, an organization dedicated to removing foreign imperialist powers from Vietnam. Worried about the spread of communism in Southeast Asia, the USA began to bankroll the French war effort in Vietnam. In 1954, the French were finally defeated by the Viet Minh at the Battle of Dien Bien Phu. This defeat was formalized in the Geneva Agreement and temporarily separated Vietnam into two zones, a northern zone to be governed by the Viet Minh and a southern zone governed by an anti-communist government led by Ngo Dinh Diem. The Geneva Agreement spelt the end of the French control in Vietnam and the beginning of a major dilemma for the USA. Firstly, Vietnam was divided into North and South at the 17th parallel, with the Viet Minh in control of North Vietnam and a non-communist government in control of South Vietnam. Secondly, the Viet Minh had fallen under the control of the Vietnamese Communist Party, led by Ho Chi Minh, so victory for the Viet Minh was a victory for communism. Thirdly, America was operating a policy of containment and feared if Vietnam fell into communism, other countries in Southeast Asia would fall too. This was known as the domino theory. The USA now decided to give its support to the non-communist government of South Vietnam, led by Ngo Dinh Diem. A brief look at Ngo Dinh Diem. Ngo Dinh Diem was an unpopular leader with the majority of South Vietnamese people. He had removed the previous leader in a fraudulent election in which he had won 600,000 votes in a country with only 450,000 people eligible to vote. He was a rich landowner in a country of poor peasant farmers. He was a Catholic and openly discriminated against Buddhists, the majority religion in Vietnam at the time. Some Buddhists, for example, the Buddhist monk Quang Duc, burnt themselves to death in protest at Diem's government. He was a staunch anti-communist, and the USA was operating a strategy of containment. Next, let's look at the Vietcong. Ngo Dinh Diem's government was unpopular with ordinary people in South Vietnam, and so it was no surprise that they began to give their support to an opposition organization, the National Liberation Front, also known as the Vietcong. The Vietcong was aided and supplied by Communist North Vietnam and its leader Ho Chi Minh. The Vietcong's message of independence from foreign control and ending the concentration of land ownership amongst rich landlords made it popular with Vietnamese peasant farmers. Ngo Dinh Diem's strategic hamlets policy had been introduced in 1962. It was meant to create safe villages and was supposed to stop the Vietcong from getting their supplies and soldiers from villages. In practice, it meant destroying peasant villages near areas held by the Vietcong and forcefully relocating the people. This made him very unpopular with the ordinary people and may have increased support for the Vietcong. In 1959, Ho Chi Minh declared a war to overthrow the South Vietnamese government and unite Vietnam under communist rule with the support of the Vietcong. The Vietcong began to fight a guerrilla war against the government of South Vietnam. So, why did America become involved in Vietnam? Firstly, the non-communist government of South Vietnam looked in danger of being overthrown by the communist-backed Vietcong guerrillas. The USA was operating a policy of containment, and they feared the domino effect, that if one country fell to communism, there could be a knock-on effect in neighbouring countries. Vietnam was a wobbly domino. Under President Eisenhower and Kennedy, the USA had given millions of dollars to prop up the French in Vietnam and had sent military advisors to support Ngo Dinh Diem's corrupt anti-communist government. The failure of these two policies had shown that providing money and military advisors to train the army of South Vietnam was not enough to stop communism. Force was needed, and this meant American soldiers in a combat role. Fourthly, they finally had an excuse. In August 1964, the destroyer USS Maddox, an American naval vessel, was attacked in the Gulf of Tonkin, just off the coast of North Vietnam, by North Vietnamese torpedo boats. This gave President Johnson an excuse to order attacks on North Vietnam. So what were the USA's tactics under President Johnson? American tactics in Vietnam can be summed up by the acronym BEAST. Firstly, bombing. President Johnson ordered the bombing of strategic military targets in North Vietnam, including air raids on the capital city Hanoi and bases and supply routes for the Vietcong. This was codenamed Operation Rolling Thunder. The USA would ultimately drop 3 million tons of bombs in Vietnam, more than all the bombs dropped in Europe during World War II. However, bombing was highly inaccurate due to the jungle landscape and the lack of industrial targets in North Vietnam. Secondly, escalation. President Johnson slowly increased the number of American troops on the ground in Vietnam. In 1965, 2 battalions of US Marines were deployed to protect military bases in Da Nang. This represented a shift away from military advisors to combat troops. In June 1965, Johnson sent another 100,000 troops and a further 100,000 in 1966. Thirdly, air and artillery. American troops were sent on patrols to be supported by air and artillery if attacked by the Vietcong. This demoralized soldiers who realized that they were being used as bait to draw out the enemy. Fourthly, search and destroy. From 1965, the American military began a policy of sending soldiers into the jungle and villages of Vietnam to take the war to the enemy. This often meant soldiers were easy target for Vietcong guerrilla attacks, as the Vietcong were far more adept in the jungle than the American soldiers. This tactic also led to high numbers of civilian casualties, destruction of villages, and atrocities like the My Lai massacre, all of which damaged the USA's reputation. Lastly, technology. The USA relied on high-altitude bombers to drop heavy bombs in North Vietnam. They used jets to dump napalm, a chemical that burnt skin to the bone, on suspected Vietcong strongholds. They used Agent Orange, a powerful defoliant, to destroy jungle cover. Helicopters were used to deploy and destroy guerrilla combatants. Television propaganda was used in the USA to report the body count of estimated Vietcong casualties. So, why did US tactics fail in Vietnam? Firstly, let's have a look at the failures of the USA. Number 1. The failure of Operation Rolling Thunder. The bombing campaign failed because the bombs often fell into empty jungle, missing their targets. The North Vietnamese guerrillas knew the jungle and made use of elaborate underground bases and tunnels to shelter from US bombs, and often reused unexploded American bombs against US soldiers. Number 2. Failure of search and destroy. Search and destroy missions were often based on poor military intelligence. The brutal tactics used by the US troops often drove more Vietnamese civilians to support the Vietcong. In 1968, American soldiers searching for Vietcong guerrillas raided the village of My Lai, killing around 300 civilians, including children. The My Lai massacre severely damaged America's reputation and undermined support for the war at home. This was made worse by the fact that the American Army tried to cover up the events of the massacre until it was revealed by journalists a year after the event. Number 3. The role of the media. Events like the My Lai massacre were reported in the US press, leading many ordinary Americans to question the war. Film footage of US soldiers burning homes and the effect of napalm all turned public opinion against the war. 4. Lack of support at home. As the war dragged on, more and more Americans began to oppose the war in Vietnam. Many people began to oppose the draft, and public figures like the boxer Muhammad Ali risked prison rather than go to Vietnam. In 1970, officers from the National Guard shot at anti-war protesters at Kent State University, killing 4 students. More people questioned the lengths the government would go to in support of this unpopular war. Secondly, let's look at the Vietcong successes. Number 1. Guerrilla warfare. The Vietcong used the cover of the jungle, which they knew well, to their advantage. They fought a hit-and-run guerrilla war against inexperienced American soldiers, many of whom were young conscripts. The threat of invisible enemy and hidden traps like punji sticks, sharpened sticks of bamboo which were laid in traps, had a demoralizing psychological impact on US troops. 2. The Ho Chi Minh Trail. Vietcong guerrillas were kept well supplied by a constant stream of food and arms from the north. These were carried on foot, by bicycle and mule along the Ho Chi Minh Trail, a jungle trail which wound its way through the neighbouring countries of Laos and Cambodia, and which was bombed by the US Army but never fully disrupted. 3. In 1968, the Vietcong used the cover of the Buddhist New Year, Tet, celebrations to change tactics and launch a massive attack on the US-held areas across South Vietnam, including the US Embassy in Saigon. The attack was a success for the Vietcong, and although ultimately they were driven back by the US Army, it showed the Americans that despite all the soldiers, bombs and money spent in Vietnam, they were not making progress against the Vietcong or communism. Many historians see the Tet Offensive as a turning point in America's mission in Vietnam. It is likely to have been a factor in President Johnson's decision not to run for re-election in 1968. He had often voiced concerns about the rising number of American casualties of the war. Moving on, let's look at ending the war in Vietnam. In 1968, with mounting criticism of the Vietnam War at home and abroad, President Johnson announced that he would stop the bombing of North Vietnam and that he would not run for re-election the following year. He was succeeded in January 1969 by Richard Nixon as President of the USA. Nixon was a staunch anti-communist, and he was concerned about the growing risk of nuclear war and wanted to ease the tension of the Cold War. He set out improving relations with China and the USSR. The US table tennis team visited China in 1971 for a friendly game of table tennis and were followed by Nixon himself in 1972. Trade between the US and China improved and tensions were reduced. These efforts to manage the Cold War and to improve relations with the communist powers, along with growing numbers of American casualties in Vietnam, may have shaped Nixon's attitude to the war in Vietnam. He introduced a policy of Vietnamization, also known as the Nixon Doctrine. This entailed building up the armed forces of America's allies until they could take responsibility for their own defense. It meant that the USA was beginning the process of withdrawing troops from Vietnam, while helping to strengthen the South Vietnamese army with the aim of getting it to take over the war against communism. At the same time, Nixon escalated the bombing campaign in North Vietnam for two reasons. Firstly, to disrupt the Ho Chi Minh Trail and hit Vietcong bases in the neighbouring countries of Laos and Cambodia. Secondly, to force the North Vietnamese to negotiate after initial peace talks from early on in 1969 broke down. Lastly for today, let's look at the Paris Peace Accords. Negotiations were not straightforward. In October 1972, Henry Kissinger had worked out a peace agreement with the North Vietnamese. However, fearing Americans were going to abandon his country, Nguyen Van Thieu, the president of South Vietnam, refused to sign the agreement, and the South Vietnamese pulled out of the talks. Nixon mounted huge bombing raids on North Vietnam until, in Paris, the North Vietnamese were forced to sign. This is a bit like punching someone while telling them that you want them to be friends. Nixon told Nguyen Van Thieu he had to make peace whether he agreed with it or not, and so he was also forced to sign. So what were the outcomes? A ceasefire was agreed and American forces would leave Vietnam. The city of Saigon fell to communism on the 30th of April 1975. The final hours of the American presence in Vietnam were a mad scramble to evacuate US personnel and South Vietnamese civilians to US naval ships in the South China Sea. The signal to head for the helicopters was White Christmas by Bing Crosby playing over the speakers of the US Embassy. Once the American forces were out of Vietnam, the way was open for the communist takeover of the South. In April 1975, the forces of North Vietnam entered the southern city of Saigon, and the country was unified under communist leadership. So what were the consequences of the US defeat in Vietnam? Firstly, the policy of containment had failed militarily. Despite the USA's superior military strength, it could not stop the spread of communism. Secondly, the policy of containment had failed politically. Not only had the USA failed to stop Vietnam falling to communism, but their actions in neighbouring countries of Laos and Cambodia had helped to bring communist governments to power there too. Thirdly, the policy of containment had failed in the propaganda war. Having presented the war in Vietnam as a moral crusade against communism, the atrocities committed by the US military in Vietnam in terms of the number of civilian deaths and the use of chemical weapons had tarnished America's image at home and abroad. Fourthly, the war had cost 58,000 Americans and 1 to 4 million Vietnamese lives, affected 700,000 American veterans, cost America over $100 billion, and damaged reputation and morale at home. Lastly, after Vietnam, the policy of containment was replaced by a period of détente, a thawing in the tension of the Cold War, and gradually relations between the USA and the USSR and China improved.
Thank you for watching our video. Please like, subscribe and share. And comment below so we can clarify things for you.